In the 14th century, Mansa Musa, who was emperor of the second great kingdom in West Africa, the first Islamic kingdom in West Africa, is going to undertake a pilgrimage to Mecca. And this was a world-famous pilgrimage. He's going to be recognized as one of the world's most wealthy men. He goes on this caravan and starts spreading gold all over the place, just tossing it out like candy all over the Trans-Sahara on his way to Mecca. Pretty nice guy, huh? He's going to make a lot of friends along the way, and there's a strategic need that he's meeting by taking this pilgrimage to Mecca and spreading all this gold. You're going to create a demand for gold across the Trans-Sahara. That's important because if you have one commodity and you have plenty of it, what happens when you have too much of something? Well, the value drops unless you can create a demand where you can offload your excess gold. That's essentially what he was doing. But we see a familiar pattern here, don't we? What happened in Rome when they based their entire society on access to trade with Asia, and all of a sudden that was jerked out from under them? We can already see the writing on the wall as to what's going to happen in West Africa. What do you suppose is going to happen to West Africa once trans-Saharan trade is jerked out from under them? You guessed it, the same thing that happens in Europe. Warlordism, feudalism, violence, disease, poverty, all of the same things that happened in Europe during the Middle Ages are going to happen in West Africa. It's going to be a very critical time at a particular moment when Europe happens to be embarking on an age of expansion. Another critical event that takes place far from West Africa but is nevertheless critical in the chain of events leading to the Atlantic slave trade is the fall of Constantinople. Constantinople is the last gateway that the Eastern Roman Empire has with Asia. In 1453, Constantinople was conquered by the Muslims and it became Istanbul. It was the fall of Constantinople that prompted Spain to hire Christopher Columbus and to sail all the way around the world to try to get to Asia, and it prompted the Portuguese to try and circumnavigate Africa. Now, what does all of this have to do with West Africa? As it turns out, it's much easier to transport goods by ship than it is by plane, train, automobile, or any other method. One can transport a lot more, a lot cheaper by boat than, say, camel caravan. So what happens when Portugal circumnavigates Africa? Africa is cut out of the picture, and the trans-Saharan trade comes into disuse. This is the lifeblood for West Africa, and when the trans-Saharan trade collapses, that's the final nail in the coffin. Again, this happens at a critical time. If you're Europe and you need to go to Asia by circumnavigating Africa, then you'd better have safe ports to stop in along the way to restock your ships and repair your sails. So what you're going to end up needing is colonies along the way. This is happening at a time when Africa is in a state of decline and it's ripe for colonization. It's here that it's important to discuss the role of slavery not only in West Africa, but in human history. We've seen slavery going all the way back to Egyptian times. It's nothing new in human history. The two things that tend to go hand in hand is conquest and slavery. Where you find one, you tend to find the other. For example, the Egyptians would conquer their neighbors and make slaves of them. The Greeks conquered their neighbors and made slaves of them. The Romans did the same thing. That's nothing new in West Africa either. So as society begins to fall apart, you descend into chaos, and what do you tend to have a lot of? What goes hand in hand with conflict? Well, slavery. It just so happens that Africa is descending, and the one thing that they have plenty of, slaves, as a result of this conflict, is the one thing that Portugal is in need of. So, just as West Africa had to adjust its society in order to survive, with its key players controlling an increasingly Islamic-controlled North Africa, West Africans are going to have to adjust their society to play with some new key players on the scene, the Portuguese. Now, the question is often asked, how is it that these Africans would have sold other Africans to Europeans? It's important to understand that this was nothing new in West Africa. There had been a trans-Saharan slave trade. There had been a trade in slavery centuries before Europeans arrived on the scene. There is no reason to think that would be any different now that Europeans have arrived on the scene, and they need the one commodity that Africa has plenty of, that is, slaves. It's also important to understand that Africans at that time didn't consider themselves Africans any more than Europeans considered themselves Europeans. Back to the issue of conquest, the question is rarely asked, how is it that over hundreds of years of conflict between Spain, France, and England, that these Europeans are killing other Europeans? Well, they didn't consider themselves Europeans. They considered themselves Spanish, French, and English. Just as West Africans aren't considering themselves to be West African, they're considering themselves to be Igbos, Ashanti, Dahomians, and Yorubans. However, as we'll see in a later broadcast, West Africans did bring elements of their society and culture into the Western Hemisphere, and much of those elements of West African culture are going to help them survive in a different setting. That's all for this episode. Next time on African Elements, we look at the enslavement of blacks in the British North American colonies. Just as we saw in this broadcast, Europeans had no problem fighting, slaughtering, and forcing other Europeans into servitude. In fact, as we'll see next time, England's first idea of what a colony was came from its subjugation of the Irish. So why is it that Africans got tagged with slave status? How did it come to be that free, white, and American came to be practically synonymous, while blacks, even free blacks, are associated with slave status? We'll explore that next time on African Elements.